yeah, this is really going to be a conversation about resilience and disaster recovery in long-term care. I am, as I was saying, the chief of geriatrics at our medical school and am currently the principal investigator on our geriatrics workforce enhancement project. But really the perspective and the experience that I bring to you today is work that I've been doing in disaster recovery and in resilience building and in nurturing our direct care workforce for a good part of my now 40-year career. My first experience actually working in this sort of long-term care space around various initiatives was actually in Connecticut through the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. I was part of the early efforts that we called Breaking the Bonds, which was way back after OBRA and way back after we were trying to reduce the use of physical restraints. And we did our first Breaking the Bonds conference in Connecticut. So I feel a special kinship with you all. Today, though, we're going to talk about resilience and recovery, and I'm going to be drawing on some experiences that I had working in New Orleans after Katrina, working in the state of Vermont after 9/11. So first, my thanks to you for being here. Thanks for what you do, and special thanks to Steve and Diane for connecting us for this conversation. I like to begin any conversation about COVID, about 2020, with just a moment of silence to acknowledge that a lot of people have died. A lot of people lost people, and that means families, friends, residents, and co-workers. So if we could just a few seconds to acknowledge that truth. Thank you very much. My goals for my remarks today are really to give you 3 ways to frame this experience. And by this experience, I really mean the whole pandemic experience, and now importantly, emerging into the post-pandemic recovery period. And I'm going to close with some new work that I'm just starting to do, haven't done it before, on something that is known as post-traumatic growth in trauma work, and I think has real applicability to the disaster recovery process as well. So I'll tell you about that. Quick reflection as we frame the experience on the year that was, and to some extent still is. As if COVID weren't enough, that particular viral pandemic, we also had the onslaught of the infodemic, which is captured there in that little graphic. And by that, I'm referring to the onslaught of information, both actual information, factual information, but ever-changing information, as well as misinformation, coupled with a whole disinformation campaign. And so the World Health Organization is now referring to that whole arena as an infodemic. And it is problematic because it takes a particular toll on our brains. Last summer, of course, we saw the killing of George Floyd, and we now just have, starting yesterday, the trial of the man who killed him. And this was another collective stressor as so many people witnessed the killing of another person, and not just another person, but the killing of a Black person, which gave birth, as you know, to a revival or a kind of resurgence of Black Lives Matter and an outpouring of support and empathy for people of color. This last January, we had the assault on our Capitol. So I'm not kidding when I say it was a hell of a year, and it has taken a toll on all of us. And then there's a little hope. There's always a little hope on the horizon if we just remember to look for it. And at the moment, it comes in the form of the vaccine. My main message in having us reflect on the year that was is to acknowledge that no one has been untouched by this. Whether you've personally lost anyone to the pandemic, whether you personally have experienced directly any of the trauma, we have experienced a collective trauma, which has really taken its toll. And of course, that's also been true at the individual level. So when I talk about trauma, when I talk about the impact that this disaster or these multiple disasters have had on us, I really want you to appreciate the extent to which we are talking about whole person stress. This has been a biological, psychological, spiritual, and social stressful set of circumstances. And it leads to a great deal of uncertainty, a sense of helplessness, and loss of control. And from a neuroscience standpoint, those are three states of mind, that uncertainty, helplessness, and loss of control, that frankly, we're not very good at dealing with. So one of the things that we look at in this work is to say, how do we counter those states? Because that at an individual level is one thing that we need to do. So at an individual level, what can we say? Human beings are remarkably resilient. I have seen people in so many disasters reach deep in themselves to come up with extraordinary energy, compassion, sort of can-do spirit, positive actions. And when we call people in the early days of a disaster a hero, we're not kidding. People do heroic and extraordinary feats. And it's part of our human capacity. You know, this isn't something that superheroes have. This isn't something that special people have. Human beings are designed to be resilient. And resilient in this context means that you knock us down, we get back up. You knock us down, we get back up. We know how to respond to threats. And we respond in the beginning remarkably well. And we show this in our grit, in our determination, and it pushes us through. But let's face it, it takes a toll. So even though we're designed for it, even though we're good at it, it doesn't work in the long haul. And we have been at this a full year. So if you are one of many like us who are running around feeling like you're running in circles, that you're distracted and exhausted and irritable, and maybe running a little short on patience, a little short on compassion, a little short on even trying to get your thoughts straight on what you want to do next, you are not alone. And there's a really good explanation why we're all feeling a little spent at this time. And it's not just that a whole year has gone on, it's that our brains have taken a beating. So I want to give you, here's your first hook into understanding kind of what's going on, I think. And then how we're going to reboot it. We have this system in our brain called the corticolimbic system, and the students know all about this. And I'm just going to give you kind of a high-level view of what I mean by the corticolimbic system. You've probably heard about all of these parts of the brain because periodically somebody like Dr. Phil or somebody else on TV lights on this and says, wow, let me tell you about your reptile brain or the primitive brain. Well, we do have this part of our brain called the amygdala. It's the oldest part of the human brain, and it's the survivor part of our brain. It's the fear center. It's the motion center of our brain. And it is designed to keep us hyper alert, vigilant, and activated for action in the face of a threat. And it's a good thing that we have it because we need it. And we need it to allow us to act, even absent all the information we might need about a particular threat. We have to respond in order to survive. And to pull it out of COVID into something just a little simpler, let me explain why I say the amygdala is a good thing to have. Imagine that you're driving down the roads, a car pulls out in front of you. You don't have time to stop and think, should I slam on my brakes? Should I swear? Should I ram into them to teach them a lesson? Should I try to slow down? How do I avoid this collision? Thinking brain doesn't work there. The amygdala goes into action, you slam on your brakes, then you might also swear, you might do any number of things, but your first action will be to try to avoid that collision. That's your amygdala working well. The problem with the amygdala is in order to do that, it has to turn off this better part of your brain. I say better, I really just should say higher functioning, this so-called prefrontal cortex, and it literally does shut it down. It sends out a chemical so that you stop thinking in that moment about your dry cleaning or what you're going to do for fun or what just happened at work or whatever it is, where your brain was when that person pulled out in front of you, you stop thinking about it. And that's the amygdala sending out a signal, I've got other things for you to do, like slam on the brakes. In doing so, the amygdala, in shutting off the brain, the way it's supposed to work is that when the disaster is avoided, the amygdala calms back down, the thinking brain goes back online. But what happens in the face of a constant threat like the coronavirus, what has happened to us collectively in the face of all that our country has faced for the last 4 years, the last 8 years, take your pick for point in time, but we've been through a hell of a lot. And I don't care whether you're on the right or on the left. If you're on the left, you're terrified of what people on the right have been doing. And if you're on the right, you're terrified of the left. We've been running around a fearful people for a long time. And the amygdala then stays activated for a really long time. And in the face of this unrelenting, uncontrollable stress, frankly, our prefrontal cortices, our prefrontal cortexes have been shut down. So our first step in recovery is to turn them back on, okay? Because we need to restore top-down control within our brains. We need to turn back on our judgment, our wisdom, our compassion, our ability to regulate our emotions, our ability to name things and to think straight. And that's our first task. And the good news is that it's quite doable. This particular graphic, by the way, is quite intentionally showing this part of the brain kind of faded out, because quite literally, when we study the brain under this chronic, unrelenting, uncontrollable stress, it starts to atrophy. The good news is it recovers, but we have to actively help it recover. So what do you do for an overactivated amygdala? Well, there are several antidotes. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to tell you two primary ones. One is that we have to remove part of the stressor, and we do that very simply by removing our exposure, say, to the news, by removing our the time that we spend on social media. I'm not saying we put our heads in the sand. What I'm saying is, if you're somebody who's a little bit of a media junkie, if you like the news and you're watching it 8 hours a day, go to 4. If you're watching it 4, go to 2. If you're watching it 2, go to 1. Reduce your exposure to the stressor. Not because it's bad, but because it's keeping your amygdala on high alert. And one of the problems that we're faced is that we have been operating in this fear zone for far too long, and it's really taken a toll. The second thing that is really, really good for deactivating or calming down the amygdala is physical exercise. There are other things as well, and we can talk about it in the Q&A, but just the big take home here is we're all suffering a little bit from overactivated amygdalas unless we're actively calming them. And it's really pretty easy in self-care to learn techniques for deactivating it. The second thing we have to do is to reactivate a part of our brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, if you like words. I just call it the ACC, and it's part of the emotional regulation part of the brain. So under times of unrelenting stress, it is underactivated. It's shut off also by those amygdala chemicals that are outpouring. And frankly, it gets a little overwhelmed. Again, we can turn it back on, and we have to turn it back on if we want to come out of this pandemic at least as good as before, and I would say better. So first thing you got to do is chill the amygdala. Just talked about that. And then the second is really, and sort of there are a lot of active processes. They can easily be taught, they can be learned. And it's really about naming. It's about putting words to what we've gone through. It's about acknowledging the circumstances. It's also from like a next step about some gratitude practices, something Duke University did called the 3 good things. A lot of evidence base here for how we turn this part back on and why it's good for us. And we can talk about it if you like in the Q&A. And then finally, what we have to do is bring that prefrontal cortex or PFC back online. It truly is the seat of wisdom and judgment. It's our highest ordered part of our brain. And we got to start using it a little bit more. Fortunately, we have a bunch of challenges ahead of us. And it is exactly what the prefrontal cortex is good at, likes to do, feels better when doing. And what I mean by that, quite simply, is two things face long-term care right now. One is a completely, I don't want to say completely, but a traumatized direct care staff, a traumatized healthcare workforce, a traumatized traumatized residents, and people need the opportunity to recover and kind of reclaim their strengths. And I think people are starting to do it. So we have to solve for the problems that have been wrought by isolation. We have to solve for the problem of families coming back in. We have to solve for the problems of the toll that it has taken on all of us collectively. And we need our PFCs for that. So that's what we want to do. So we want to develop some strategies for recovery. Again, nice evidence base for a particular intervention known as loving kindness meditation is actually really good for turning the prefrontal cortex back on. The ACC, which I just mentioned, actually responds very well to mindfulness practice, but the PFC responds better to loving kindness meditation practices. And it turns out, I just was reviewing this morning for another talk I'm giving at the medical school on the neuroscience of compassion. And it's amazing what small acts of kindness do for re-engaging our prefrontal cortices. I say all of this to say that most of what I learned, or much of what I learned, frankly, comes from the wisdom traditions, but it's all reinforced by science. So for me as a physician, it's just like a great combo. At the collective level, there's also something I want to share with you, and this is another frame of reference for trying to get our handle around what we're going through and what we've been through. This particular graphic is one that was developed by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration of the federal government. And SAMHSA developed this, gosh, a long time ago. We used it in 1990, whatever it was, 5 or so, after Hurricane Katrina, to try to get a handle on the stages of disaster recovery. So as you can see on your screen here, thinking about Katrina for a moment, every year they have hurricanes, right? So there's this pre-disaster period that they're very, very used to in high disaster zones. Could be hurricanes, could be tornadoes, whatever. They have evacuation plans, they have sheltering in place plans. They kind of get ready for it. And then if they get hit hard, as they were in Katrina, there is, as we saw with COVID, this extraordinary period of time in which everyone's a hero, right? And you hear that phrase all the time. And by those heroics, people mean this kind of, you don't even think about your own safety. You put yourself in harm's way for the sake of others. There's this extraordinary period of selflessness and needing a little less sleep and working harder and working as a team and engaging and doing whatever needs to be done without, I don't want to say without complaining, but without even kind of thinking about it, right? And so we have this great capacity, and our communities recognize it. And we go through this honeymoon period where there's tremendous community cohesion. I still think, about stories, my mother who lives in Florida, telling me how every night in her condominium, people, and she lives in a condominium where like the average age is 90, came out on their balconies to bang pots and pans just as some way to say thank you to people who were on the front lines. And there are all kinds of stories, and you have stories, and absolutely facilities have stories of what they witnessed, what they did. And one of the challenges, I think, in this whole period of heroics and then the following honeymoon period is that very often direct care workers, nurses' aides, certified nursing assistants don't get like called out. by name, by group. They sort of grouped into like, and other healthcare workers, where we talk about doctors and nurses. And so there's always this little bit of sour taste, if you will, for direct care workers, not everywhere, but some places where they're ignored. So they may or may not get to experience that same appreciation from the community as others. But this is a pretty clear pattern that happens in disasters, and certainly we saw it in COVID, and inevitably it is followed by a period of disillusionment. There isn't enough PPE, there aren't enough staff, people aren't paid enough, the federal government's response is inadequate, the state government's response is inadequate, and we fall into a funk. And the problem with that, of course, is that we sort of need not to, but it's kind of inevitable when you feel like you've been left holding the bag, and that whole initial amygdala-driven, adrenaline-driven rush is over. And so there's this kind of emotional dipping. Now, the other thing that I like about this particular graphic, and kind of describing our shared experience, is that it acknowledges that this isn't a straight line. This isn't like, oh, get ready, pre-disaster, it hits, heroics. It doesn't go like that. It's really kind of up and down and up and down. And then we enter this period of reconstruction, which I like to think most of us are entering now. And when I say us, I really do mean people in long-term care, those that have survived, lived through, dealt with outbreaks in their facilities, who now are in communities where there aren't new surges, who have people vaccinated and so forth, that we're gingerly moving towards reconstruction. And there are some ways to move towards reconstruction that are actually going to predict the success of some homes over others. In disaster recovery, we know that there are sort of three main ingredients that we can bring to this to make success more likely. They're summed up as the 3 C's, and the reference is there for you. But it's regaining a sense of control, a sense of coherence or meaning, and then restoring and strengthening all connections. And that is, sort of talking about facilities within the facility, with the larger community, with families, with residents, residents with each other, residents with staff, etc. How we do it is pretty, frankly, straightforward, and it's based on like our knowledge of how you help people after disaster, and also based on what we've just been talking about, the brain. One of the things that really helps communities is to frame the experience in a way that there's a kind of a general way of talking about it. And you do this through telling stories, by extracting the lessons learned, both positive and negative, and reminding ourselves that not everything is COVID. That's one of the things I remember the most. I met with so many. We were mostly working with CNAs and other direct care workers, some nursing staff and administrators in New Orleans. And when we would come in, and they would say in this sort of affectionate way, please, could we stop talking about Katrina? Anything but Katrina. We'd say, sure, what's on your mind? It's the talking that matters, the telling stories, the naming of the experience, activating that ACC, so to speak. And what's important in acknowledging things is not putting a happy face on everything, but acknowledging this was awful. We were afraid. We experienced a lot of loss. There is much to grieve. We will grieve in our individual ways, and we will grieve in our collective ways. And we will also move on, and we will experience positive emotions. And the important thing for you to know is that when we're working with people around the sort of naming of the experience, it's really important that we all not just say, oh yeah, that was awful, but to actually elicit the specific concern. What was the worst thing about it for you and your family? What was the hardest? So really getting the specific impact, because speaking in generalities, frankly, is kind of cookie cutter, doesn't help anybody very much. And then again, actively rekindling that notion of creativity. And the best way we do that with staff is to engage them in solving the problems that we have to face, asking their opinions, sometimes doing it their way instead of ours, helping people rebuild confidence, acknowledging everything that they've gained, and establishing what I think has been strengthened in COVID, which is a sense of community. And this is certainly what we heard at Katrina. The common themes that emerged among successful homes there were these. They were the ones who acknowledged their fears as well as their strengths, their tears and their laughter, their wish for independence. We can do this on our own. We don't need the government. We don't need our friends. We don't need anybody. But they came to recognize their interdependence. And that's the other thing that COVID has really taught us in spades, is this whole realization of how interconnected we really, really are, and that they needed each other. And they found this to be a positive, not a making them feel helpless kind of discovery. Finally, in terms of the collective in Katrina, one of the biggest lessons that the administrators took away from this and taught us was that they needed to psychologically prepare their teams for the next hurricane season, not just get their evacuation plans. And this is something that I'm really emphasizing with work in long-term care, is that you can have the best infection control plan possible. And if your team is not psychologically prepared to carry it out, it's not going to happen. So we developed this sort of, I don't really call it a strategy. We extracted these lessons from the work in Katrina. And here's what seemed to work. Those homes that developed really had a sense of team, really a sense that we're in it together, which means that the administrator was on the floor of the gymnasium after they evacuated, helping the direct care workers truly care for people. They were there, and that it wasn't separate administrators. People really worked together, and they knew that they were in it together. Secondly, a sense of confidence, a real belief that we actually can do this. There was a time I didn't think I could ever do it again, and now I know I'm ready. And there are, again, interventions. There are ways to help people reclaim, rebuild, regain their confidence. And that's a critical part, I think, of the recovery. And then finally, nurturing resilience, which we will touch on again very shortly. Finally, I want to talk to you about this new area of exploration that I'm involved in, which is this notion of post-pandemic personal growth. We know that people who have experienced trauma and I'm talking about personal trauma now, individual trauma earlier in their lives, are vulnerable in certain ways to being traumatized again in the future. And we know that people with individual traumas are vulnerable to higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and so forth. But one of the interesting things about this collective trauma is that almost any reaction that people have, I would say, is not pathological. Almost anything that's happening is an understandable response to a uniquely abnormal situation. And so what I've come to appreciate is that one way to look at this pandemic period is to look at coping skills as taking us in a couple of different directions. One direction that coping skills take us in is to the restoration of homeostasis or balance, right? And that's what resilience is really about. When we talk about people, bouncing back, we're really talking about knocking down and standing up. When we talk about transformational coping, and this is what I'm so interested in now, we're really looking at opportunities for post-pandemic growth. And this does borrow heavily from the work of Tedeschi and Calhoun, which you can see there on the slide, who really looked at this and looked at trauma and said, not everybody with serious trauma remains vulnerable. Some people grow through the experience and actually find it transformational in their personal lives. So I actually tried this, a set of strategies with a group of people living with dementia that I've been meeting with for a year. And this was a support group for people living with dementia that was sponsored by the Dementia Action Alliance. And we've been meeting every week since last end of March, early April. I mention them only to say that this is a set of strategies that actually can allow people to take a piece of personal growth from this experience. And it does not require a PhD. It does not require our highest order. It requires paying attention to actually what's going on. And so I'm looking forward to doing more of this. It's not evidence-based now because no one's done it as far as I can tell. But this is one thing that I'm going to be starting in the upcoming year. And to give you a taste of how it's done, I'll just invite you right now to reflect for yourselves about one positive lesson or one discovery that you made about yourself during COVID. And you can share it in the chat box if you wish, but you needn't, depending on how personal it is or how private you are. But if you want to share, you certainly can put it in the chat box. And I will go on to the next slide, which is just our recap slide. Your takeaway is this. If you want to get better control of your brain, you need to actively replenish your body, mind, and spirit. Replenishing the body, mind, and spirit is really a matter of getting back to health basics, which means to eat well, sleep well, hydrate, get plenty of physical exercise, and as the picture there denotes, spend time in the natural world. It turns out that our brains are actually better in nature, and we need to spend time in the natural world. Going for a walk is absolutely the best thing, but if that's not your thing in nature, even looking out the window at the sky turns out to be good for your brain. It actually opens up psychological space, we call it, activates different parts of your brain, shows you horizons, and it's another way of re-engaging that prefrontal cortex. So you got to actively replenish. We talk about this all the time as self-care, but we want to tie it to why we do it. The second thing you need to do is reclaim and recharge your thinking brain, or reboot the cortico-limbic system, as I say. Chill that amygdala, reactivate the other parts. And then finally, within our long-term care space, I think we need to, having brought our best parts of our brain back online, we really need to look at what we've achieved as a community through a sense of connection, what we've learned about the harmful effects of breaking that connection, as we saw with residents being isolated, with staff being isolated. We have to really turn our attention to that, but in a way that allows us to have open minds and open hearts to changing things for the future. And I think if we use these various frameworks, that we will in fact be able to get there. So that's kind of a whirlwind of how I think about this at the individual and collective level. And I thank you for your attention. And now let's talk. Any of this resonate with you? Any of it make sense to you? Toss a word in the chat. First word that comes to mind. Does it resonate? Yes or no? What do you think?
It's so much. It's, you know, I knew when I was joining this session with everybody that it was the first thought that comes to mind is just was so overwhelming. There's so much that we're getting back to doing and healing along the way. It's overwhelming. I get emotional. Honestly, I really get emotional when I start thinking about where we need to start going, you know, with this and what we went through. So it's almost so big. I haven't even had the chance yet. You know, I think a few months ago, I had talked to Steve about, we did have somebody partner with us just start talking about what we went through, literally at the very most basic level, just talk about it. And we knew it was just going to evolve from there. And I think this is just highly necessary that this overwhelmed. And I always have plenty to say and think, but this just has been it's just overwhelming. And next steps, you know, with how we deal with our new world.
So Sarah, let me ask you something, if I may, and
Mhm.
then I see somebody else's box lit up. My intent, my desire is to help it feel less overwhelming. But I myself felt as I was talking fast that it could be seen as like quite overwhelming. Like, where do we start? And so I want to ask you, did this feel like a path forward, or did this feel like it too was overwhelming?
Oh, 100% a path forward.
Okay.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Super.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I saw somebody else's box light up, but I missed it. Who it was? So please speak up.
This is Andre from Orange Healthcare. I have to agree with Sarah, and I think I can speak for the staff here, that it is emotional and overwhelming. It's hard not to talk about it without getting emotional. So I think that what the doctor has said can provide a path forward and maybe an understanding of why we are feeling the way we're feeling.
Mm-hmm.
That why sometimes we were strong when we needed to be strong, and now when it seems that it's getting better, maybe we're more emotional now. Different part of the brain turning on. Maybe, for an administrator, not in the medical field, I understood that. Why am I emotional now when in the middle of it, we were all, scrubbing floors and grabbing patients and not a tear. But now all of a sudden we can't hardly talk about it without breaking down.
Yeah. And let me ask, I'm sorry, Andre, is it Andre or Andrea?
Oh, it's Andre.
Yeah, Andre, thank you. Let me ask, is there a culture of comfort with tears in your organization? Because I frankly can't imagine talking about this either without tears. And that's why I borrowed one of those phrases from our homes in Louisiana. Oh, I've just got so many great clips, because I'll tell you, the other thing we did there was make a movie. We interviewed people, and Steve and Diane heard about this. And that's what one of the CNAs that she said, I admit it, as though she had to, I cried. But it was when we cried together and laughed together that we were able to move on. So my question is, of course, we're going to become emotional when we're really talking about it, right? Not just describing it, but really talking about it. Is there room for tears where you are?
Yes, there's room for tears here. And I think I, we have room for tears here, and it's because I think that it's hard to hold them back. And
Yeah.
I support it, and I can't hold it back. My director of nurses, she supports it. She can't hold it back. So I think when they see us not being afraid to show our emotions, and we support them,
Excellent.
Fear and sadness are real emotions.
Yeah. I got to tell you, it's so important. And a lot of cultures are a little tear avoidant, if I can use that phrase. That it's like they only have grit. It's like that. And I find particularly, and I think many of my nursing colleagues would agree, that nurses in particular, it's like blinders on, head down, don't talk to me about feelings, because it feels disruptive, right, to like the work that needs to get done. And for a time, that's actually true. But that time is like 9 months ago, right? I mean, it's not, we don't need to stay stuck there. So hats off to you and your DON for not being able to show what you're really feeling, because, our feelings are just that, and they're very legitimate, and they pass, and they're real, and we have to honor them, so that we can name them and then begin to tolerate it. Who else?
I just want to share one thing that we did do here about naming it, doctor, and then I'll get off, is that um, we thought a silly idea, I don't know why, but we thought a rock garden where we brought out paint and we let staff, we thought just paint your feelings on a rock and we would make an outdoor rock garden. Find enough paint and enough rocks. It went on for weeks. Staff just kept painting, religious symbols, patients' names, their own names, designs, anything that was inside them just came out on these rocks, and it was amazing. So you're absolutely right about just expressing yourself and letting other people express themselves. It's one step, I realized, but I was amazed at what I thought was just some, little idea that we could do as a project that we could socially distance and do all shifts. I couldn't buy enough paint or find enough rocks. So,
Andre, I love that. And I'll tell you why I love it, because it was spontaneous, organic, fit your culture. You came up with it. You just put it out there and it resonated with people. And then you created the conditions in which they could keep doing it. Now, I could just say, I could put it back into our brain talk and say, you were activating their ACCs, that anterior cingulate cortex. You got it named. And that action, okay, truly does calm the amygdala, which is why people wanted to do it. Because when we get out of our own way, we actually, if we trust our intuitions a little bit, get out of our way, we sometimes know exactly what we need and we just do it. And so I would also say that by providing the paint and encouraging people to do it, that you were showing a kindness that actually alleviates some of the suffering. And, and I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it to be Pollyanna-ish. I say it because in the wisdom traditions, people know something about kindness. And it turns out so do the scientists. So thank you for that. I love that rock garden idea, and I may steal it if I may.
Go right ahead. Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you. Who else? Thoughts? Any part of this that doesn't? The one thing I would ask you to comment on, and I asked Diane and Steve about this the other day. I have talked with a lot of really quite traumatized nursing staff, and they have experienced so much what's being called moral distress and moral injury from what they were not able to do, and to the number of people that they watched die that they felt they ought to have been able to help. And I'm always a little hesitant until I form a relationship to even introduce a notion like post-pandemic growth, because it feels in some ways a little insensitive. But I think Sarah and you, Andre, both captured this as saying, you don't have to start with that. It starts with acknowledging what's been. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. Does the post-pandemic growth part of this presentation resonate in any way, or does it feel premature? That's really what I'm trying to suss out as I work with various places on, trying to help people find a path forward. Thoughts about that, anyone?
I really enjoyed your presentation quite a bit. A few things. One, the vast majority of our membership here in Connecticut is Black and brown, and the intersection with race and the COVID experience, and in particular, the intersection of the power dynamics within the nursing homes are quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say fairly bluntly, there is a significant lack of trust from the union membership in their management. There is anger towards their management of their employers. There's lots of feelings.
Mm-hmm.
We're in active bargaining with almost all the employers on this call and all the employers in the state of Connecticut. And we're seeing that come through in our bargaining discussions. I think this would greatly benefit the membership of our union. But I think that there needs to be some recognition that the experience of predominantly Black and brown women is different than that of the white managers who led through the experience of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And if that isn't acknowledged, I do feel that there's going to be a sense of members shutting off from this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I thought you did a great way of connecting the social change movements that have happened during COVID over the last year, and how they are also reflective of the COVID experience in a significant way in long-term care, particularly in Connecticut. So I think that talking about that is very important. I'll say that our membership feels ignored by the white regulators in the Department of Public Health.
Mm-hmm.
There's been actions and discussions publicly and privately that have ignored the experiences of caregivers in the most traumatic ways.
Wow.
You know, we have some members who were asked to do things that they felt violated their personal moral codes.
Yeah.
On the way they cared for people. Yeah. And they feel quite violated as a caregiver, as a worker, as a union member. And if there is going to be a process out of this that's better than the communication before, the communication during, and this communication after, there has to be some sort of acknowledgement that experiences is different.
Mm-hmm.
Not competitively different, just different,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not like one trumps the other. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But there has to be an acknowledgement that the experience of a Black woman who's giving care in a nursing home is different than her white administrator.
Yeah.
So it's just a reflection that I think that you should take a look at. And I appreciated the pieces you added around the summer and even more recently, because in our membership here in Connecticut, race and gender expression and identity is a massive issue.
Yeah.
It's something that it's quite at the forefront of our discussions in bargaining, collective bargaining agreements, or in dealing with the COVID experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jesse, for all those thoughts. Yeah, it's, yeah. We cannot have these conversations without talking about race and gender. We really cannot. We cannot have these conversations without talking about social justice. I do think that my goal is to try to have the conversation in a way that's not polarizing at a time when our entire civil discourse is uncivil and in our entire culture is built on divisiveness, because I think for kind of obvious reasons. And so I keep trying to find a way, not towards the center, but towards acknowledging that the experience of women, and particularly women of color, and particularly poorer women, is distinctly different than the white leadership, the white regulators, and I'm clearly a white woman, and you know, at least anybody whose picture I can see on this call is white. And so I get that. And one of the things that we really saw in New Orleans is that much as you just described, Jess, for your membership, they were people of color, the Black women who were the ones who, helped people survive, were being led by white administrators. Now, fortunately, here's, I think, the thing for you all to think about if there is a way for me to be helpful to you going forward. We were in New Orleans for 5 years. The rebuilding does not come fast. I don't think our rebuilding from COVID is going to be a 5-year endeavor. I do think it's going to be a year-long endeavor. I think that particularly for myself, being a white woman, often seen as a white woman of privilege, certainly being seen as a white educated woman, that the trust that I build with women of color, that I built with women of color in New Orleans, did not happen on the first visit to New Orleans, right? But I will say that it happens, and it happens pretty quickly, because I think people do appreciate that I get it on some level. And I've worked in this space a lot, and that, my goal is to empower them. And so I think it can be done. I don't think it happens fast. I think some of it is just starting. What we built on in New Orleans, as it happened, the team that I was working with had been working in New Orleans already, or had just started in Louisiana, New Orleans, and in Lake Charles, with the Culture Change Coalition. So there was already this culture change initiative underway. Facilities were already coming together. So we kind of built on that infrastructure for building our program, but it could be done a lot of ways. I noticed, Steve, it is, 2:02.
Yeah.
I have time, but I do want to honor your all's time.
Yep. Yeah, I was just doing a time check as well, I think, and just because we had told people 2:00, so we should finish up, and so would like all of us to think about next steps, think about what that could really mean. I know we're doing with Susan another session. We've invited folks for this Thursday. It'll be a repeat. So some people are planning to come who couldn't be here today, hopefully a few others from different companies. Jesse, I know Almina, I think, is going to join us Thursday morning as well. And and then we're going to talk afterwards. I think we're going to debrief afterwards with Susan and Jesse and all of you would like to debrief in various combinations, I think, after we've had another session on Thursday and we see who's there, and think about what this could mean for the union and for each of your companies. Sarah and Tom and Teresa and Andre, I hope this has gotten some thoughts spinning a little bit. So please keep spinning. And, if you'd like to send me an email, we'll, put down some thoughts as well. And I'll email you, I think, individually, perhaps, so we can think about this. And, after Thursday morning, when we've met with a few others with Susan, we'll put some thoughts together. And, maybe next week I should plan on getting something out to everybody to think about what some options might be for Susan to work with any of your nursing homes or companies, either individually or together. I don't really haven't formulated a thought at this point on how that could work, but, or maybe some combination thereof of working with individual facilities and staffs and bringing people together on occasion also. But let's think about that. Because I think Susan's experience and insights just seem really valuable. Jesse, your insights extremely valuable also, and all of you appreciate your thoughts. So anyway, I guess those are my thoughts to close up. Any other thoughts? We should let people go. It's 2:05, but any other thoughts, or questions anybody would like to share before we sign off for today? Okay, well, hope this was
Thank you all so
interesting.
much.
Yeah. And we'll certainly be in touch.